So now let's go on and consider some reasons why someone might think that the second premise is true. So, some support for the second premise comes from, again, the way that we sometimes talk, right? We do tend to talk in ways that might suggest that we have a right to do whatever we want to with our property. For example, if you own a car, then you might think that you have a right to sell your car. Sometimes we even talk about being able to sell certain body parts, maybe, for example, your hair. You might even think that in a case like prostitution or for a sex worker, that maybe there's even a right to sell your body in this sense. Now, that's an interesting case because there are plenty of people that think that prostitution or being a sex worker is immoral, that you do not have a right to sell your body in a case like this. Yet at the same point, it's not obvious, right? There are people that think that that is something that should be morally permissible. So in that sense, at least, it seems like intuitively speaking, someone might think that you have a right to sell your body, even if it's the case that you are identical to your body. But what about the claim that we have a right to destroy our property? You might think that that's just intuitively obvious. If I own something, I can do whatever I want with it. That's the general idea. So, for example, if I own a car, presumably I could destroy my car if I wanted to. Or if I own my hair, then I can cut it or do whatever I want with it. Of course, that's not quite the case. In my situation, I don't have too much hair to do anything with. Nonetheless, we do sometimes think that we have the right to destroy our property, even if that's a body part that we own. But what about intellectual property? I think that's another interesting case. We do sometimes think that we have a right to destroy intellectual property. So if I am a famous artist, presumably I have the right to create some masterpiece and then destroy it. And so you might think that, yes, we do have a right to destroy our property, but now I want to go on and consider some reasons why we might object to this second premise, the premise that says we have a right to destroy our property. So consider, for example, one's limbs. If you own your arms or your hands, do you have a right to cut your hands off and destroy them? Do I have a right to become an amputee, for example? That's not as obvious. Maybe there are reasons why we should let people choose to become an amputee. That's an interesting thing that we're going to consider later on. But at least what we should say is that's not obvious. And what about in the case of intellectual property? Let's say that I come up with, I don't know, the cure for cancer, right? That's considered intellectual property. Would I have a right to destroy that? Maybe I would have the right to destroy my artwork or a piece of music that I composed. But the cure for cancer, something that could save millions of people's lives, well, it's not at all clear that I have the right to destroy that. Another interesting case is, what about public goods? So consider, for example, a house that you might own that's, a historical building. Just because you might own and you might occupy a historical building, does it automatically follow that you have a right for it to be destroyed, for it to be razed? I think a really interesting example here is the recent fire of the Notre Dame Cathedral. I mean, people talked about the fire as if it was a part of the moral community that was being destroyed. Lots of people described it as just a complete travesty. There's pieces of artworks that were saved, and it was almost as if somebody's life had been saved. And again, Warren sort of suggests a similar kind of example. So if somebody owns a house, somebody's trespassing on your property, that doesn't mean that you have a right to kill the person that's trespassing on your property. Maybe in the case of self-defense, at best you would have a right then. But if somebody's just walking across your yard, you don't have a right to kill them, even if it's the case that you have a right to do whatever you want to with your property. And so I think the basic point that Matheson and Davis are making here is simply that even if there is a kind of right to do what you want with your property, that doesn't mean that it is unlimited, right? That doesn't mean that there aren't any restrictions whatsoever. And finally, the last point that Matheson and Davis make is similar to what they said with regard to the right to genetic privacy. So they again appeal to this idea that even if there's a right to destroy one's property, and even if the fetus is considered to be the property of the parents, the right to the death of the fetus would only apply if the fetus was a clone. And the reason why is because the fetus has 50% of the genetic material of both biological parents. just as we saw in the case of the right to genetic privacy. Now, interestingly, Rosanen responds to this objection in the same exact way that he responded to the previous point about genetic privacy. Rosanen claims that this is a misunderstanding to think about the right to the death of the fetus in terms of a right that only one of the biological parents would possess. Instead, we should think of it as a collective right. And since Rosanen thinks that the genetic parents engage in this collective act of procreation, which in a sense creates the fetus, and thereby they own the fetus, well, then they would also have a right to the death of the fetus insofar as they collectively own the fetus. However, I do think that it's important to point out here that Roslin never actually offers a straightforward defense of any kind of a Lockean theory of rights. Roslin just kind of seems to automatically assume that the first two premises are true. In fact, what Roslin actually says is common intuition supports both premises. And so it seems like Roslin is simply appealing to intuitions here. But somebody might wonder, whether a Lockean view of rights is even consistent with Rosanin's notion of a collective right to the death of the fetus. And this is particularly interesting since Locke did not really think that we owned our children, even though Locke did think that we owned our bodies. And so insofar as Rosanin is appealing to a collective right, it's not clear that that is consistent with a Lockean view of property rights. Likewise, Rosanin doesn't really say too much in response to Matheson and Davis's point regarding the limitations that are involved with property rights. Rosanen seems to suggest that, yeah, there might be some limitations, but why should we think that the limitations are to be applied in the case of the fetus? And so somebody might think that this particular response is not quite adequate. And finally, I want to consider a really interesting point that Rosanen makes regarding disagreement. So given that the right to the death of the fetus, if it exists, according to Rosanen, it would be a collective right, then there would be cases where there's disagreement. In fact, it seems like there would be lots of cases where there's disagreement. What exactly does Rosanen say about this? Well, suppose that the father wants to keep the fetus, and let's suppose that the mother wants to acquire the death of the fetus. What should we do in a case like this? What Rosanen says is that we should simply go with a kind of a default position, or what Rosanen describes as the status quo. For Rosanen, the status quo would be to continue and let the fetus live. And so in this case, we would need to side with the father. That means that we should have the fetus removed and implanted in an artificial womb where it would be gestated. But notice that this looks like it would violate the woman's right to autonomy. So in a case like this, we would have to side with the father. The mother should be forced to undergo the ectogenesis procedure. But that, again, would seem to violate the woman's right to autonomy, the woman's right to do whatever she wants with her body, her right to self-determination. And insofar as the argument that we're considering is kind of supposed to be based upon the notion that you can do whatever you want with your body, well, then this seems to undermine the whole point, the whole argument that we're considering. That seems to undermine the entire argument from property rights, the basic idea that we own our bodies and we can do whatever we want with our bodies. And so what I want to do now is I want to consider a few questions for you to think about. First, I want you to think about the claim that there's a right to prevent parenthood. Is this a good argument? Do you think that Matheson and Davis have some good responses to this argument? Or do you think that Rosanen's appeal to a collective right is a good response to what Matheson and Davis say? So think about the way that this particular argument goes and what side you fall on. Likewise, I want you to think about the claim that we have a right to genetic privacy. Is this a good argument? Would this show that there is a right to the death of the fetus? And then finally, I want you to think about what we were just considering, the notion of property rights. Do you think that this is a good argument? Do you think that we have a right to do whatever we want with our property? Do you think that we own the fetus? Do you think that if we do have these sort of property rights, that this entails that either the woman or the biological parents have some sort of a right to the death of the fetus? And in addition to these 3 points, I also want you to think about whether Rosanen has done, an adequate job of arguing for his position. Has Rosanen actually shown any positive reason to believe that the right to the death of the fetus if it exists, should be understood as a collective right. And this is important because this is the basic way in which Rosanen is responding to Matheson and Davis. And so if you don't think that the right to the death of the fetus should be understood as a collective right, then you need to try to think about whether or not the right to the death of the fetus exists as a right that the woman alone has, or whether Matheson and Davis is correct in claiming that the right to the death of the fetus just simply does not exist at all, given the possibility of ectogenesis. And in addition to these questions, I also want you to think about a couple other points. And this is supposed to be in preparation for the kinds of things that we're going to either talk about in discussion this week or something that might be asked with regard to a reading response question. So first, I want you to think about whether or not there's some particular unique property or something very special about a human womb that would make it the case that ectogenesis would not necessarily be the best thing for the fetus or perhaps the mother. And I also want you to think about if there is some special property, what would that be? Could some future technology even provide a safe alternative to gestation of a fetus in a human womb, right? So is it the case that ectogenesis is even plausible at all? And then finally, I want you to think about whether or not ectogenesis is a kind of a way of playing God. And if you do think that it's a way of playing God, is there something wrong with that? Is playing God something that we should refrain from doing? And explain your reasons to support that. Once you've done that, I then want you to consider whether or not there are any other reasons to think that ectogenesis would not be a morally permissible alternative to lethal abortions. So, for example, maybe you could argue that the foster care system would be overwhelmed, or the welfare system in general will become overwhelmed with children in need of good home, and that would be kind of a consequentialist-based reason to argue that ectogenesis would not be a morally permissible alternative. And maybe you could even argue that there would be a problem with overpopulation in general. Maybe that would be a good reason to object to ectogenesis. Or you might think that people would be, generally speaking, forced to rethink their own family size. Could that itself be the basis of a good objection here? So those are the sort of questions I want you to be thinking about. First, in preparation for any read and response questions for this week, as well as the online video conferences that we'll have for our discussion sections this week.